Welcome to the Backpacking Light podcast, where we discuss the philosophy and skills of traveling light so you can experience the outdoors with more comfort, more safety, and more enjoyment. I'm Ryan Jordan.
And I'm Andrew Marshall, and we are your hosts on this lifelong journey of doing more with less as we venture into wild places and empty spaces.
Look for me in the mountains, where walking has a way of pulling you to your peace of mind every day.
Today's episode is about Backpacking Light's recent guided trip into the Absorka-Beartooth wilderness of Montana. The trip was mostly off-trail and focused on backcountry navigation and group decision-making. In just a minute, we'll interview Chris Shultz, a participant on the trip, and later in the episode, we'll talk about some of our favorite navigational gear, both traditional and electronic. We'll also introduce a brand new podcast segment called Hiker Hacks, and as always, end the show with Here and Now. In the meantime, Ryan, you called this trek one of your favorite trips you've ever done with Backpacking Light. Why is that?
I think the opportunity to bring a full crew of people together, we had 11 people on this trip, a full crew of people together who are from different backgrounds, different geographical locations, different levels of experience and hiking styles and things like that. And then meld them into a group and say, okay, you're going to start here at point A. Shuttle's going to drop us off. And then you guys got to figure out how to get dozens of miles south to point B, which is where our exit vehicles are going to be parked. Now go plan a route. And just being able to see like eyes widen up and excitement coming to a brand new location and being able to craft a new route from point A to point B is something that's really cool to watch. And so there's this dynamic of excitement, and then it evolves into nervousness and then a little bit of fear once they get into the mapping exercise and they start looking at maps and realize, oh my gosh, there's no trail from point A to point B. And then they look at satellite imagery and see that there's going to be some bushwhacking involved. There's going to be some climbing up to 12,000 foot plateaus and descending a scree slope down into an alpine lake basin and lots of options that are clearly impassable due to cliffs and things like this. So it's this problem solving exercise that you watch people exert tremendous amounts of research and energy and eventually creativity to coming up with a plan that meets the needs of the group and gets them across this incredibly magical terrain, complicated and high mountainous terrain, and then have them take those first steps on the trailhead with this confidence of a child almost that's like, okay, let's do this. And then watching that evolve into, oh my gosh, we got to implement a plan B and then eventually a plan C, yet still sees such a high level of engagement. It's a really satisfying thing to watch as a mentor or a coach or a guide.
Yeah, what really stuck out to me about it, I was lucky enough to tag along on the trip, was watching the group make decisions sort of in the clutch, standing up on top of high plateaus when the stakes were really real. And to watch, 11 people try to come to a consensus, especially in a circumstance when there was no real leader. It was a really fascinating exercise in human psychology and how groups interact under stress and under pressure. Just really, really fascinating.
Yeah, it's a cool dynamic because there's more than just the challenge of the terrain that you need to solve. We had bad weather come in and had to make some decisions based on the weather. We had one person in our group suffered from altitude illness the first couple of days pretty severely. Everyone reacts to challenges differently. Some people are more intimidated by traipsing through thick brush in grizzly country, and other people are more intimidated by climbing a talus slope to a 12,000 foot peak. So yeah, just watching that group dynamic evolve and play out certainly has an impact on how these things work. And no two trips are ever the same. And this particular group was just awesome in how they kind of pooled their resources together emotionally and psychologically, especially, and solve the problem of making it to our exit vehicles. It was pretty cool.
Well, our guest today was a participant on the trip, and we're going to jump straight into the interview so he can sort of tell us all about the nuts and bolts of the trip. So, Ryan, why don't you introduce him?
So, Chris is 54 years old, and he joined our trek with his son, Nick, who is 26 years old. So, a father son duo. It's a really neat dynamic to have along, and reminds me of a lot of the really cool trips that I've done with my own adult son Chase, and I was really looking forward to seeing and getting to know these two. So Chris has been backpacking seriously for about 15 years now, and he's been in the backcountry quite a bit. He sea kayaked in Glacier Bay, backpacked in the Yukon, Patagonia, Pacific Northwest, and the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. He's a wilderness first responder, level 1 avalanche certified, has done some winter mountaineering and camping in the Adirondacks. So he comes to the trip with a fair bit of experience, and as a dad and experienced adventurer, he comes with a level of maturity that really brought a lot to the trip. So I'm really excited to have him along on the trip, and I'm glad we got to interview him today. I asked him, as we were getting to know each other several months ago, what's your objective for this trip? And he said, well, I'd like to get my base pack weight under 10 pounds. And I will say he came really close to that. He had one of, if not the lightest pack on the trip. And then his second objective was not to be airlifted out of the Beartooth on day 2, which he achieved that objective. And his third objective was not to cry in the Beartooth. And as far as I know, he didn't cry. I didn't observe him, but he may have slid off behind a boulder and done his thing. I just don't know. But let's get to the interview and have a discussion with Chris Shultz.
Well, Chris, thanks for joining us on the Backpacking Light podcast.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, so we'll just jump right in here. What made you want to come on a backpacking light trek? And in particular, what made you want to come on this particular trek?
I had been doing quite a bit of backpacking since about 2005. Some courses and also some solo trips and personal trips. A lot of the courses that I participated in, if they had one major shortcoming, it was that they were pretty committed to traditional heavy backpacking. And as I've matured over the years, I've gained an appreciation for a lighter pack. And so I've been a lifetime member of Backpacking Light since 2006 or so, and always been a fan of the organization and of Ryan's. Why I chose the Whitetail Trek was pretty simple. My son and I, coming from the East Coast, I couldn't really justify coming out to Montana, or at least it was not my preference to come out to Montana for 3 days. If we were going to dive in to all the logistics of getting out to Red Lodge, it made sense for us to do a longer trek.
So tell us about your previous experience in the backcountry. You said that you have been hiking since 2005. So actually, I guess what my question is what caused you to get interested in backpacking in the first place?
My parents actually took me up to Alaska to visit my uncle way back in the mid 1970s, and that's really was really car camping, but it really gave me a real appreciation for mountains and the wilderness, and that's something that I've carried with me all through my formative years and young adulthood. Unfortunately, I didn't have many opportunities to do a lot of backpacking as I went through schooling here on the East Coast. But once I had a little bit more flexibility in my personal life, decided that I wanted to really get involved in backpacking and wilderness activities. And so I started to take some courses, sea kayaking and backpacking, and then took several courses with National Outdoor Leadership School in 2008, 2009, 2010, including a trip leader course, which is a bit of an abbreviated instructor course, and did some winter backpacking as well in the Adirondacks and the High Peaks region. And then once I gained enough confidence, I started to venture out and doing my own solo treks. And I've been doing that for the last several years, increasingly trying to get a lighter pack.
I can certainly empathize with your first experiences in the backcountry. The first time my dad took me out into the middle of nowhere where there was no people, I grew up in Seattle. It was an eye-opening experience for me, and that was also kind of the seed that got me passionate about the backcountry in general, and eventually backpacking, because I knew I could walk farther than most people would want to travel from their car. So it added a whole new dimension and dynamic. So walk us through the months prior to the trek. I want to talk about your strategy for preparing for the trip. So let's start with gear. What sort of changes to your normal gear kit did you make for this trek in Montana, and why did you make those changes?
The last time I was on a solo trek, I was pretty pleased with my overall gear kit. So there were actually, I did not make that many changes to my gear kit in preparation for this particular trek. I went with some heavier gaiters, which I actually thought was probably overkill and unnecessary. On my last trek, solo trek, I did have a bear in camp, and I had an ultralight headlamp that was of little use in that particular complication.
So it was bright enough that you could see a large nondescript shape out there.
Correct. So I've since learned that I would prefer a more robust headlamp with more lumens, particularly in bear country, and particularly when I'm solo.
So after the trek, we as a group kind of did a conversation where I'll sit around and we talked about what gear worked for us and what gear didn't work. And I'm curious as to what your thoughts were on that personally.
I think that I was pretty pleased with how much of my gear functioned for me. My pack I thought worked great. My sleeping system was adequate. I did experiment with the REI Magma 10 sleeping bag, and I found that the REI Magma 10 was a little bit snug on me, and I probably needed a little bit more room. But overall, the sleeping system worked well. My shelter was a Z-Packs Soloplex shelter. That I think functioned satisfactorily. There was a moment during our trek when we thought we might be setting up camp in less than ideal conditions on a plateau, and I was concerned that it probably would not have been sufficient in more severe weather. I had chosen an extraordinarily light wind shirt to experiment with this trip, 1.7 ounce Montbell X-Lite, and that proved to be much sturdier and more resilient than I had anticipated or could have expected. I didn't take that off, I think, the entire trip. And it was fantastic in that I wore that in a t-shirt for most of the time, and that was as long as I was moving, that was very adequate warmth and wicking. Let's see, my water bottle system, I think, still needs a little bit of revision. I had a water bottle on the side of my pack, which in a solo trek, I think it works fine for me in the past. I could easily stop whenever I wanted, take the pack off, and just access the water. In a group setting, sometimes stopping even for a few minutes is problematic if each of the 11 participants decides they want to take their pack off and stop every for a minute or two. That slows the whole group down. So my probably need to fashion a holder for my water bottle on my chest or my hip belt, so I don't have to stop for group treks.
And so let's talk about your pack for a second, in particular the modifications that you made to it, because your water bottle holding system was a mod on your pack, right?
Yes, it was. Yeah, that was a couple of shock cords on the daisy chain on the side, and was a Powerade lightweight water bottle. I am a big fan of compression straps on the sides of packs for a variety of reasons. Number one, I prefer a well packed tight pack. But number two, I do occasionally put my trekking poles on the side of my pack, and also when I'm not in a large group, a personal locator beacon. So I do like to have those on the side. So what I did, got some uh, lightweight spectra cord and some lightweight cinchers, and fashioned some strapping. Took the webbing off my pack and fashioned some strapping with just the lightweight cord. And that has been proven very, very effective and very resilient. So I've been very pleased with that, and reduced the pack weight somewhat, and lost no functionality.
So let's move into physical training for this trek. What were you expecting, and what did you do to prepare?
I was expecting exactly what we got. It was a very demanding trek, very demanding terrain. I had actually been coming off a hockey injury, and so my I was actually not working out as much as I would have liked.
So you mentioned that the terrain was very demanding. Go into that a little bit. What parts of the terrain were demanding and unique to relative to what you've done in the past?
Yeah, so I guess the first big hurdle for me, and the one that gave me probably the most pause, was the elevation. So although I'd been doing quite a bit of backpacking in the last, well, certainly backpacking at least one long trek annually for the last several years. Never been to that, never hiked in at that elevation. So I was not, I was unsure how I would perform at the higher elevations. Um, I I did not appreciate any obvious problem with the elevation on this trek. I think the terrain was challenging, and I was tired, but I don't know that I can say that it had much to do with the elevation. The terrain itself, a lot of bouldering, a lot of talus, um, uh, some steep ascents and steep descents, a little bit of snow, quite challenging, not only for myself, I think, but for the group as a whole. Some of it was on trail, and obviously that was a nice respite on occasion, but certainly the off trail experience was by far the most enjoyable.
So do you feel that your training was sufficient? I mean, I know you were recovering from an injury, but did you train sufficiently for it? And if not, what would you do differently, or what recommendations might you have for somebody training for a trek like this?
Just getting out and hiking more would probably be preferable. If I had been able to do more long hikes on the weekends leading up to the trek, I think that would have been beneficial. Ideally, with a pack, striving to be at or around your ideal body weight is always preferable. If you're carrying extra weight, then obviously you're undermining the basic premise of ultralight backpacking. So I think striving to get closer to one's ideal body weight, and then hiking more in preparation for a trek like this, I think would be ideal.
Yeah, there's so much that goes into these kinds of things. So there's elevation, which is obviously really hard to train for unless you live or can train at elevation. You've got steep hill climbing, so there's definitely a cardio component there and a strength component with your lower body.
Mm-hmm.
There's bushwhacking and talus hopping, which brings you off balance quite a bit. And the when people ask me, how do you train for stuff like that? It's like, keep your pack weight as low as possible, and practice this kind of stuff. Then you have the awareness going in that, oh, I'm going to be off balance a little bit, and it's okay, and I got to compensate accordingly with trekking poles or strength training or things like that. And then there's the element of, you said it, you wished you could have hiked more, and especially with a pack. And I can't emphasize that point enough, because that alone can condition your feet, and the ability to spend long days on your feet. We had some really long days out there, up to 12 plus hours.
Yep.
Spending long days on your feet requires just a base level of a conditioning for your feet, so you don't get ankle fatigue and blisters and things like that. And I think that's really valuable too.
Yeah.
So, Chris, you showed up in Montana to start the trip. And so, what were the next few days like?
We checked into our hotel and made arrangements to meet up with the entire group Saturday evening, where we started our trek planning. Trek planning, as you know, continued through Sunday before we hit the trailhead on Monday morning.
Yeah, let's dig into the route planning process. How did it work? What tools did we use?
Yeah, so this was a wonderful learning experience for me. I had certainly not used all of the online resources that are now available. I was fascinated at how useful Google Earth 3D images were in really walking us through potential routes. Different people had different favorites, websites like All Trails or Hill Map, I guess, and Cal Topo, some online mapping resources. I've been more accustomed to using USGS quads and typically textbooks not textbooks, but trail guides that describe the routes in detail and are usually published annually for a variety of areas. But I had not had much experience using the online resources.
Trail guides did us precious little good on this trip. So a little bit of backstory: we gave you guys a starting point, and we hired a shuttle to take our group to that starting point on Monday morning, and then we gave you guys a finish point where we'd be parking our cars for our exit. And then the criteria was go from point A to point B. Now go plan your route. And one of the things that was really interesting to me is this route was broken up by a few huge valleys, a couple of big plateaus, and a whole bunch of giant peaks. And there was no trail from point A to point B. So we had to kind of mix it up and weave a route through there. And so I think I saw you guys use satellite imagery a lot to try to evaluate potential areas where there were cliffs or impassable areas. You used slope angle analysis on some of the online mapping tools that you had, so that you could see that, yeah, this slope's 50 degrees. We're probably not going to be climbing up and over that. And the other one that I found really interesting is some of the climbing journal sites like Summit Post. So you guys were actually reviewing the approaches and in some cases the actual climbing routes that mountain climbers in the Beartooths have used for years to scale the peaks out there. So to me, that was a really cool thing to see you all integrate all these different things to try to craft a route in a virgin area, so to speak, from point A to point B. I thought that was really neat.
Yeah, no, I did too, and I think maybe I misspoke when I said trail guides, but yeah, this is the Summit Post descriptions of routes, as you said, climbing routes. I thought was very very helpful at times as well.
So I've read all these books on navigation and route planning, and there's the idea or the desire, maybe is a better term, for people to follow a linear process to plan a route from point A to point B. Do this step number one, and then do step number two, and then do step number three. But in a complex route environment like this, where there are no established routes, or you have to piece together uh, 15 different pieces of information to craft a route from point A to point B, it tends to be much more iterative and chaotic. Can you comment on that at all?
Yes, it at times it was indeed chaotic, and so as we went through the process with I guess 8 students, each sharing their thoughts on where they wanted to go and how they wanted to get there. And then, what if we can't get there? And what do we do next? And so I think it was a fascinating experience with a lot of different opinions flying back and forth, and a lot of areas that people wanted to potentially investigate. And then, of course, once I think we had formulated a route that everyone was comfortable with, then we said, well, why don't maybe we can do it in reverse, which then forced us to kind of reinvent the wheel, going in the opposite direction, and see if that would be a more attractive option. So it was very collaborative, interesting exchange that ultimately resulted in us coming up with a plan that quickly changed.
So by the time we had a route plan in place, what were you thinking? Were you nervous, scared, excited for what we were about to attempt? And what sort of percentage would you have put on that route as 50% chance of success, 25, 90?
Yeah, I probably would have put it at around 50%. I wasn't scared. I think when during these types of endeavors, I'm always concerned about people's health and well-being, and not only the route difficulty, but the route difficulty when someone is not 100% with an injury, for example, and how best to get the group as a group through the trek. So I probably would have guessed 50% chance of completing the route as planned. That might have been a tad optimistic, but that's probably what I would have guessed.
Yeah, I was at 50% as well during the beginning of your route planning process, probably a little less with the final route that you all planned.
Oh yeah.
And I think it was only less than that because of the prospects for getting bad weather in the middle of the trip, which our weather forecast was projecting. And the other issue is you plan an ambitious route like this, which was over two extremely high passes off trail, where we had little to no data about the routes over these passes and what the terrain was like or anything like that. And all we had was satellite imagery, and that always like makes you really nervous about. Everybody's got to be firing on all cylinders in order to really pull this off. Plus, you have to have environmental conditions that allow you to do it. So,
Absolutely.
in combination with those two things, especially with a group, it's a miracle when some of these really ambitious things actually come off. Did the final route look like your planned route?
No,
And if
no, it did
not,
not.
why? So why was it different, and how did that evolve?
Yeah, so the day one went as planned. We made it to our destination, Princess Lake, and And I think most people hit the trail feeling quite good. Everybody, you're always energetic on day one of the trek. So day two, however, was a very challenging day. The plan was included a very difficult or perceived to be difficult ascent and descent through a mountain pass. Um, and early in the day, it became quite clear that we would be far behind our planned timeline with a probable, potentially treacherous descent with the sun setting or at dusk or with headlamps. And that became a an option that was no longer feasible. And so we had to go to one of our contingency plans and deviate from the original plan.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. The route that we had originally planned involved 3 miles of what many climbers say is some of the most laborious boulder hopping in the entire range, if not the entire northern Rockies. So it's a very famous approach to Montana's High Point, Granite Peak, but it's also one that a lot of people do their best to avoid.
Yeah.
The cool thing about deviating and going over frozen death plateaus, we got to traverse this 11 to 12,000 foot plateau all day long, and it was really neat to be up that high and see those views. And ultimately, we made it down and off the plateau and into a valley that night, safe and sound for the bad weather that came in for the next couple of days.
Yeah.
So and then by then, you guys actually were not only on contingency plan B, but you were on contingency plan C, because we had hoped to get off the plateau down to another lake that was on another off trail route that we'd planned to our cars.
Mm-hmm.
We decided that it was even too late in the day to finish that one. And so we found a trail, got down, and now we're on this plan C.
Correct.
And we didn't have a plan C in our back pocket. So what was your guys' approach to realizing that plan A and plan B that you guys had designed routes for back in the cabin were now out the window, and now you're totally flying by wire here?
Yeah, well, that was actually quite exciting. So we did go to Plan C. Plan C was a more gradual descent off the plateau and actually onto an established trail. And we used that trail to kind of recover and kind of find a camp below treeline for the evening. And although we got into camp in the dark, I think everybody was ultimately satisfied that we were able to get off the plateau safely and avoid any serious injury. But then at that point, we had to refashion the entire trip. And so, because we had essentially gone off script, and so much like we had done in the living room a few days prior, we again had to formulate a whole new plan.
And my overwhelming memory of this trip will always be like 6 people huddled around a map on, a high plateau, trying to keep the wind from blowing the map away, trying to decide what to do next. So that being said, what new navigational skills or knowledge did you come away from this trek with?
Well, I was, you and I had talked about using map and compass, and I do still. I think we can all agree that's the standard. But I was it was really educational for me to watch people use their cell phones to navigate. I used my GPS a little bit more than I usually do. The problem with a map and compass in a large group when there are 6 GPSs going is that there is no patience to triangulate your location on a map when people have their GPS out. So I learned to put the map away and use the GPS when folks decided that's what they wanted to do. As far as other navigational skills, just I think it's one of the things that I like about for me personally, the map and compass is that because I'm not in the backcountry throughout the year, it always forces me to retrain myself and to re-educate myself and to relearn how to do basic navigation with map and compass, and so I kind of welcome that opportunity every time I'm out. But I did certainly somewhat grudgingly, but certainly embraced using GPS technology on a more regular basis. And then it's always great fun to do just route finding, just by terrain. And we did certainly had numerous opportunities to do that, and I think quite successfully in many instances.
Navigation tools, whether it's map, compass, GPS, or any of these things, can only take you so far, and you've got to really look on the ground where you're at to find out what your next best 20 steps are going to be. Even if you're bushwhacking, we were looking for game trails that would facilitate easier travel. And if we were in the alpine zone and saw a slope up a steep hillside or a mountainside, there were clearly routes that were better than the others that would have never been revealed using maps or GPS units.
Absolutely.
So many of the Trek participants, including me, had never hiked in grizzly bear territory before. Was this a new experience for you as well? And if so, what did you learn?
Actually, it was not a new experience for me. I'd actually spent quite a bit of my time in the backcountry in grizzly country, having been in Alaska and the Yukon, and to a lesser degree, obviously in the Pacific Northwest, which probably has very little grizzlies these days. But I'd actually been I've been as comfortable as one can be, I guess, in grizzly country, at least with the basic approach. I was comfortable with separating cook areas from food storage areas from campsites, and I've practiced with bear spray before. I've never had to actually use it on a bear, thankfully. But I certainly had practiced before. This was my first time using Ursacs, but I've certainly used bear hangs and bear-resistant food canisters. And I'm pretty conscientious, I feel, about making the appropriate amount of noise when on trail. If not conversation with others, then just making sure you're making noise if you're heading towards a stream, or if the wind's in your face, or if you're going up and over a ridge, so as not to surprise any charismatic megafauna. Let's see. I think some of the other participants had little or no experience in grizzly country, and I was just a little bit encouraging for them to remember to not leave their toothpaste or their hand sanitizer in their pocket, and make sure that it went into the Ursacs. And I think for the most part, people were receptive to some guidance, and keeping their bear spray at the ready. And I think one I think aspect of bear safety that needed to be reinforced is that there's strength in numbers, and so trying to stay together on the trail, as well as particularly at dusk, when you're hanging or securing your fur sacks, your food, that you don't go alone, that you keep one or two people with you. So Nick and I would certainly wait for people to finish doing what they were doing. We tried not to let people walk alone in the dark, so that they were had a little bit more protection with some colleagues.
Groups are always your best defense in grizzly bear country, and I I like hiking in a group because it removes a lot of the smoldering underlying stress that comes with looking over your shoulder, wondering if there's a bear around or if you're making enough noise and things like
Yep.
that. But as a guide, with a group, the only thing I really get worried about is, as you said, people walking alone away from camp, especially at night, or the group getting spread out on the trail. So now you've got one or two people way out in front and effectively their own
Yep.
lonely little group, and then surprising a bear. But where are you at, Andrew? This was your first trip in grizzly country, and what'd you feel?
Yeah, I would second that about the group. I had a hard time remembering. So we had the bear spray, hooked onto our packs where we could get to it easily, and so I was never very nervous about the bears, but I did have a hard time remembering to make sure that I had that bear spray with me if I ever walked away from my pack, like to get water or to go to the bathroom. It's just not in my muscle memory yet, and it's not in the forefront of my brain. So I really struggled with that. I suppose if I ever have a close encounter with a grizzly, I'll never have trouble remembering that again.
Yeah, you don't. It does do something to your habit making when you start seeing grizzlies out there. And I still find myself when I'm down in southern Wyoming or Colorado, and I don't have my bear spray, I'll still pat my pat my waist for it, like somebody looking for their weapon, and it's not there, and I'm thinking, oh yeah, there's no grizzlies up here. But yeah, it's definitely something to consider. Okay, so Chris, a couple of if you could choose one thing type of questions for you. The first one is, if you could make one decision before or during the trek that was different, what would it be?
Let's see. Before or during, I would probably choose to be 10 to 15 pounds lighter.
And the second one is, if you have one major takeaway lesson from the trek, what is it?
Probably ultralight is the way to go. I think I was very pleased with how how I prepared for the trek equipment wise, and enjoyed or never lamented having to put the pack on in the morning, and never felt that I had to get it off my back in the evening. So I'm a total convert to ultralight backpacking for sure.
These two answers highlight, I think, the two most important lessons when it comes to backcountry travel. The first one being, your own body weight and your fitness level. And the second is being intentional and serious about reducing your pack weight. You combine those things, and it is absolutely remarkable the type of backcountry adventure even normal people can pull off. And this week in the backcountry with all you guys was proof of that, and very rewarding to watch.
Yeah, it was truly a pleasure to be part of it.
So, Chris, just one last question, and it kind of gets into the psychology of our group a little bit. So, you mentioned that your adult son Nick joined us on this trek, and one thing that I noticed was as the trek went on, Nick kind of developed a greater and greater leadership role within the group, and I was just curious what that was like as a father, and if you had to ever weigh in your mind, like when to speak up, when to be silent, and sort of when to let your son sort of be his own person on this trek.
I think it was actually a wonderful group for Nick, in that I think that although, as Andrew alluded to early in our trek planning, although we had a lot of advanced degrees and a lot of mature adults that were confident decision makers, in their own right. I think a lot of the folks on the trek were very comfortable to let the youngest guy in the group kind of uh, uh, take the lead on point, as it were, and route find and let him make some of the errors route finding that so they didn't have to. But yeah, I think Nick benefited greatly from really being embraced by the group as a whole. And really, I think he did a good job, and I think they trusted in him, and it worked out fantastic. For me personally, I think that there were a lot of people that had strong opinions about where to go and how to get there. And I think a couple of us in the group, were quite comfortable taking a little bit more of a back seat and a little bit more of an advisory role, as opposed to always being in the thick of the route planning. And so I kind of was had decided to take a back seat not only to my son but also to some of the other folks on the trek, and provide input only when necessary. But no, I think Nick really did quite a nice job, and really impressed me, and I think he surprised himself, and gained a lot of confidence.
As the dad of an adult son, I totally concur with where you're at on that. I think one of the most satisfying things of parenthood is being able to watch your child grow and learn and develop their confidence in real time when they're like practicing this in the thick of it. And sometimes that takes us to back off a little bit and just watch. It's
Yep.
good.
Well, Chris, is there anything that you wanted to talk about or address that we didn't get a chance to talk about yet?
I would just say that I think that this was a fantastic experience. I think that all participants came away with very satisfied with the week, and with what the group was able to achieve together. I think that we we were able to avoid serious injury. We were able to avoid putting ourselves in a dangerous position, I think everybody had an opportunity to grow as an individual, and as a backpacker during our week together.
Well, Chris, I totally concur. It was one of the best weeks I have ever spent in the Beartooths. You guys were a great group. I really enjoyed hiking with you and getting to know you, and very appreciative that you came on the podcast with us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's been enjoyable, and nice to touch base again with you and Andrew, and maybe we'll do it again next time.
All right, so Ryan, what stuck out to you about that conversation?
Interestingly, I always begin these conversations, and I do this in the debrief, and ask a lot of questions on the trip about gear. And to me, the real challenge of this trip has nothing to do with gear. And for these guys, I think most of this crew had their gear so well dialed that it got out of the way. And that to me is one of the best things I love about ultralight backpacking, is that once you get this all figured out and your pack weight is light enough and the gear works and you know how to use it in inclement conditions and whatnot, then it just kind of fades to the background. And that allows a lot of other things to come forward, like the your ability to focus energy on the group dynamics or solving navigation problems and things like that. And that came out to me in Chris's conversation because he kept going back to the satisfaction of, trying to understand for example, how to cope with, well, our plan A is out the window, our plan B is out the window, and now we're on plan C. And he was really excited about that. And so stuff like that is to me the standout experience of really difficult group trips like this.
Yeah, I touched on this in the introduction, but the thing that stuck out to me is the group dynamic. And Chris mentioned this in the interview, but interestingly enough, we had, of the 11 participants, I think maybe 8 or 9 had at least master's degrees, and we had probably 3 or 4 MDs on the trek. And so going into it, I was pretty interested to see how that group would work together. And when we had to go from plan A to plan B, it was, I think, psychologically the worst possible time. It was like 3:30 in the afternoon, far enough away from lunch that everyone was kind of starting to get hungry, and we had just climbed a huge hill up onto the plateau. Uh,
And we were
and
all out of water and looking
and
for
we were all
water.
out of water. Yeah. So I was kind of interested to step back and look at, okay, how is this group going to handle this? Just to echo your point about this trip really had nothing to do with gear. And so it was really interesting to see which people chose to sort of step back and which people stepped forward, and the way that the group sort of tried to gel very intentionally so that we could come to consensus on things.
Yeah, that's an excellent observation.
Just a navigational point, Ryan. Have you ever been lost?
In very mountainous environments, no. And the reason is because in areas where you've got a lot of extreme topography, it's not difficult, assuming you have the skills and the foundations. It's not difficult to figure out that you're in a valley and you can hike up to a ridge or a peak to get a view and figure out kind of where you are. The most challenging environments I've had to navigate in are those that are heavily forested and the contours are very subtle. Some of the foothills of the Olympic Mountains on the eastern side of the mountains in Washington State have this character. Some of the western slope of the Cascades, especially the North Cascades, have this character because, in a place like the Beartooth, you can walk from the prairie at 6,000 feet through forests up to 9,000 feet. And that's not a very long distance because the topographical changes are so dramatic. But you look at the west slope of the Cascades, from almost sea level to tree line at 7,000 feet, you could be walking for 30 miles. And it's such a different environment. And so, places like the Sierras or the Beartooth, you got these dramatic topographical changes that give me a lot of confidence. And then, I haven't spent much time out on the Appalachian Trail, but of what I have spent out there, that's intimidating to me because it's difficult to see the terrain around you and figure out where you are. Now, on the AT, of course, you have, white rectangles painted on the trees, so that's certainly helpful. But if there were no trails out there, I think that would be a much more intimidating environment for me.
Yeah, it is. And actually, a lot of AT hikers walk in the wrong direction sometimes after breaks. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, I've read stories about people getting lost and even dying from taking a bathroom break and not being able to get back to their pack. It's kind of scary.
So, have you given any thought to what next summer's guiding season might look like?
Yeah, we're launching our 2019 Wilderness Adventures registration process in November. Kevin Fletcher, our trek director and the other guide on this trip, and I are working those details out. This year was very successful for us. It was probably our best year so far in terms of participation and feedback and just the general level of satisfaction from our Trek participants. So we're really excited for next year. And so we'll be keeping the programs we have, which include the Sundance and Timberline treks. This Whitetail Trek was a long form program, 6 days in the backcountry, 8 days total. That was a relatively new format for us, and really excited how it turned out. So we're going to hone this a little more and offer that trek again probably next September as well. So unlimited members will have access to early registration starting November 16th, and then registration will open to the public on November 26th. And then if you want to get a feel for what this trek was like, obviously listen to this podcast, what you're doing. And then over on Instagram, we told the story of the trek day by day through photos and captions. So check it out over on Instagram.com/backpackinglight, and you can read all about how the Whitetail Trek unfolded as well.
Yeah, and you're really going to want to see those pictures too, because just hearing us talk about it doesn't really do the Beartooths justice. All right, well, let's move into our gear segment. So the last episode that we did, we talked pretty extensively about the Garmin InReach Mini, and you wrote a huge review on it on the website. So given that, and given the subject matter of this episode, I thought it might be interesting to talk about some of your other favorite navigational tools. So just to start out with, for someone just beginning to learn to navigate by map and compass, what do they need to get started?
The very first thing is they need to study the topic. So I want to point people into two directions. The first is a good, solid foundational book to teach you the basics. And probably my favorite is the National Outdoor Leadership School book called Wilderness Navigation. It's been through several editions. In November of this year, they're coming out with a brand new edition that's updated, and it brings in a lot of the new technologies in navigation as well. So I highly recommend that one. Again, it's Knowles Wilderness Navigation. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. The other one is I really think people should familiarize themselves as much as possible with maps. And my two favorite online mapping tools are CalTopo and HillMap. And these allow you to change the layers so that you can see the relationship between topography and, for example, satellite imagery. And as you start to become comfortable with things like, how vegetated is it in a river draw? What's the terrain like above 11,000 feet in the Sierras? And then you look at the satellite imagery and you see, well, talus and scree is pretty common, or tundra if it's flat. So understanding the relationship between topography and satellite imagery, I think, is important. And it's certainly interesting and very fascinating as well. But that's not enough. You need to go out and practice these skills in the field. So in terms of maps, if most of what you're doing is trails and easy off-trail travel, a 1 to 50K scale map is plenty of resolution, especially in, again, mountainous terrain where topographic features are fairly prominent. If you're doing more difficult off-trail travel through subtle areas or more forested areas, then you might have to go to a higher resolution map on the order of 1 to 24,000, such as a USGS quadrangle. I think a basic tool that is mandatory for understanding how this all works is a compass with at least a 2-degree resolution. Less than 2 degrees is probably not necessary because we don't really have a need to navigate at a lower resolution than that. And then the final tool I recommend is your own smartphone, which most of us are carrying, using it for backup and as an accuracy check to see if where you think you are is really where you're at. Smartphones have built-in GPS units in them, and if you combine it with a navigation app that has topographic maps on it, then you can pinpoint your location on that map and compare it to what you're guessing from your paper map and compass.
So what's your favorite mapping app?
My favorite is Gaia, Gaia, and I use it on the iOS platform. I'll put a link to that in the show notes. And I like it because it's quite easy to use, very intuitive. It collects a lot of statistics that are interesting if you want to track your day's progress and things like that. And it allows you to download and import multiple different map sets that you can use while your cell phone is disconnected from cellular or internet. So I've got, whenever I'm hiking in an area, I always download 24K USGS topographic maps, as well as the satellite imagery, and usually a map set that shows up-to-date trail information, because the old USGS maps don't necessarily have up-to-date trails on them.
So, what about someone who's developed a basic level of navigational skills but's ready to move on to the next step? What would you recommend resource wise?
As you develop basic navigation, you're naturally drawn to more difficult routes, and to accomplish more difficult routes in less amount of time, to do them faster, some tools are really valuable for that. And like I said, the smartphone is a very useful tool. But if you're not having the smartphone booted up all the time and on, wasting battery life and things like that, and it just takes time to use, and some of them are difficult to use in the sun or with gloves on or things like that, I still prefer a GPS tool that's dedicated. Now, because I have a smartphone, I don't want to replicate the exact same function. So the two GPS tools I like to use are the InReach, which we talked about in the last episode. And really, that's an emergency communications device, and that's its real strength. But it does have the ability to interact with your smartphone, and then you can use Garmin's EarthMate app on the phone as a GPS, it works well. It's very useful. The other tool I really like is a GPS watch. And I've used a variety of different models through the years. Right now, I'm using a Garmin Fenix 5X Plus, which is a watch that has an integrated map set in the watch that you can download maps to. It has obviously GPS features. It can track your route and provide statistics there. And it provides you with some physiological feedback if you're into like training and things like that. So it has an integrated pulse oximeter, an integrated heart rate sensor, an LED optical one that it takes the heart rate off your wrist. And, it's not as accurate as a chest strap, but it provides you with some really valuable data to help moderate your heart rate when you're hiking. And I found that to be immensely valuable for me.
When using the Garmin Fenix 5X Plus in navigation mode, what was the battery life like?
I can do 2 to 3 8 to 12 hour trekking days. And so I generally make it a habit to top it off with an external power bank at night. So I keep all that in my sleeping bag to keep it warm, and it lasts a long time. So yeah, that is a consideration when you're on a long backcountry expedition.
Well, it's time for a new segment that we're calling Hiker Hacks. This segment is all about crowdsourcing solutions for common backpacking problems. I've chosen the question for our first installment, which is this: how do you get a hydration bladder to dry out completely and quickly for storage? So, just a little bit of backstory. This has come up for me because after many years of turning my nose up at them, I've recently started using hydration bladders for longer day hikes. But we have a pretty small space, and I have to keep my hiking equipment very organized inside of our little cabin. This means I can't really have my hydration bladder hanging upside down off our pots and pans rack for a week while it dries, which is the only solution I've come up with so far. So, Ryan, it's time to turn on your engineer brain. Any thoughts on this problem?
Yeah, I think hanging wet backpacking gear in a house that you share intimately with a partner is not good for your relationship long term.
No.
So yeah, this is worth investigating a bit. So my solution with bladders and water bottles in general is, after I've cleaned them and rinsed them, obviously you have moisture left in them. So cap them and store them, and you're going to find out that they will grow mold or worse when you retrieve them at a later time. So that's obviously not an option either. So one thing I like to do, especially with bladders, is I will take some paper towels, roll them up loosely, and shove them in the bladder. Leave all the zippers and caps off the bladder to get maximum airflow through there. And then right when I do that, I will shake the bladder vigorously so that the water droplets that are adhered to the inside of the bladder walls disperse, and then they get absorbed into the paper towel. So then you end up with a paper towel that is eventually moist, and the humidity inside the bottle is going to be absorbed by that paper towel. And then because that water spreads out across the surface area of the paper towel, it evaporates faster, and so you end up with a dry bladder. The other option I've tried, I honestly have not found it as effective, is using silica gel packets. And silica gel is a desiccant, so it absorbs water, humidity from the air, but they don't work as fast as a paper towel and shaking every now and then. So what I have observed is that silica gel is great for preventing moisture buildup. So if I'm packaging a backpacking meal and I want to store it for a long period of time, I'll throw a small 1 or 3 gram silica gel packet into the meal and zip it closed. And I know that it's going to stay fresh for a long period of time because that silica gel is kind of a hedge against moisture accumulation in the meal. But with a water bladder that already has water in it, you need a pretty large gel packet to absorb that water. And so we're talking about on the order of 30 grams of gel for maybe a 3-liter size bladder. And honestly, it just doesn't work as well as the paper towel method. So that's what I use.
Obviously, humidity differs from place to place, but what's the time you found in general with the paper towel method?
Well, I've spent the last 30 years in low humidity climates, where the humidity average is 12 to 20%. So for me, literally, I can throw paper towels in my bottles and store them in a dark place, even outside in my storage unit or shed or something like that. And I'm confident that they're going to be dry within a few weeks, which is about as often as I'll use them, unless I'm using them for day hiking and things like that. So yeah, they can dry out pretty fast in a dry climate. I don't have experience in a humid climate such as the Southeast to know if that's a feasible enough solution there.
Well, I'd be interested in hearing from my fellow Southeasterners on how they've solved this problem. Listeners, is this a problem you've already solved? Let us know. Send us your solution at podcast@backpackinglight.com, along with other topics that you'd like us to address on Hiker Hacks, and we'll share it with the BPL audience on a future podcast.
Our next segment is Here and Now, where we share any recent hikes, adventures, gear, and thoughts that we've been having recently. So for me, again, I mentioned earlier, we're getting ready to launch our Wilderness Adventures program for 2019. So we're planning routes and areas and dates and the structure of the program, tweaking it a little bit every year just to improve it and create a more positive experience for those of us who participate in it. And it's really cool because every year over the past couple of years, we've developed a new core of guides, and we're continuously training. And one of my favorite things, part of this program, is our guides training that we do in June every year up in Montana. So I'm actually starting to get down into the nitty-gritty of planning that activity, and I'm really excited to go back to the Beartooth, even though I was just there a few weeks ago. So Andrew, what have you been up to?
Well, I've been thinking about risk management a lot lately. This has come up for a few reasons. Rachel and I have recently started to explore our new home here in the Eastern Sierras, and we went on a day hike up Mount Rose. So you start in the parking lot at about 8,500 feet, and the summit is over 10,700. So let's see, we just went last week. So at the time of recording, this is early October. So we weren't expecting dramatic conditions at the top of the mountain, but that's certainly what we found. We got to a part about half a mile from the summit, and right out of tree line, there was a pretty severe slope with shin-deep snow across it, and we were going to have to make a sketchy, slushy-looking traverse to continue on to the summit. It's a popular trail, but we were the first ones on the mountain, and I was feeling pretty comfortable making the traverse. We'd just come from the Beartooth, so I was pumped up, I guess. But my wife, Rachel, didn't feel comfortable with it. So we stood there in the wind talking about it for a little bit. And until I finally convinced her, and she said, we should keep going. We're really close to the top. And interestingly enough, her saying that is what made me think, whoa, wait a second, what are we doing here? Because how many times have you read in an accident report or a book, you know, climbers and hikers making a stupid decision for the exact same reason while we're really close to the top? So we turned around and we hiked down the mountain, second guessing ourselves the entire way because, by the time we were halfway down, we'd passed 5 or 6 people headed back up where we just come from. Most of them weren't as prepared as we were. But I think we did make the right decision. And the whole experience just has me doing a lot of thinking about risk management and decision making. And I don't really have a direction on these thoughts yet, but I am reading an excellent book. It's been out for a while, Ryan. I think you said you've read it 3 times. It's called Deep Survival: Who Lives, Who Dies, and Why. We'll put a link
love
to
that
it.
book.
We'll put a link to it in the show notes. But it's a fantastic book that really delves into all those issues.
It really is. And I think risk management is one of the underappreciated parts of wilderness travel in general that people take for granted. And I guess my own rule of thumb is I look at momentum. So if you're climbing higher and it's getting colder, windier, more foul, and you're getting more tired, and the conditions are less than what you expected or less than what you prepared for, or your gear's not working or anything, and you still are going up, that might be a red flag. Now, it's one thing to get, up the mountain and partway down by the end of the day and think, well, we've got 80% of the route behind us. Let's head back to the car. We're going down to the car. We're going to follow that momentum towards easier conditions and safer conditions. But when you're in the opposite scenario where you're going into more foul conditions and things aren't going right, that's definitely worth pausing.
Yeah, the thing in the book, which again I can't recommend enough, that really sticks in my head is, just to paraphrase it, he talks about how just because nothing bad has happened to you as a result of your stupid behavior, that tends to get people thinking that their stupid behavior isn't stupid. There's a false equivalence in their head, and so that's what I'm really trying to pay attention to lately in all of my adventures.
That's really good. That's wise.
Well, that's it for this episode. This podcast is brought to you by backpackinglight.com, which has been providing information and education about lightweight wilderness travel since the year 2000. The Backpacking Light podcast is supported by subscription fees paid by our loyal website subscribers, and we are extremely grateful for your support. A backpackinglight.com subscription can save you time and money on your quest to lighten your pack weight, spend more time in the outdoors, and connect with a community of like-minded hikers. So, if you aren't yet a backpackinglight.com subscriber, please consider subscribing and gain access to nearly 1 million forum posts, 4 million words of original content, more than 2,000 articles, and access to our wilderness adventures trekking programs, which we've talked about extensively in this show. You can subscribe online right now at backpackinglight.com/subscribe.
And if you have feedback, questions, or tips for our listeners, please share them via email at podcast@backpackinglight.com. You can download the show notes for this episode by visiting backpackinglight.com/podcast. And this podcast is available on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Google Play, SoundCloud, and YouTube. Leave us a review. It helps other people find the show and gives us valuable feedback.
Thanks for listening to the Backpacking Light podcast. I'm Andrew Marshall.
And I'm Ryan Jordan. And if we can leave you with one parting message, it is this: pack less, be more, because lighter is better. Happy trails, everybody.
So I shoulder my backpack, walk away from the